I am giving an overview of history since 1945 with an eye towards uncovering the patterns to give insight into the world we live in today. And in this part of the series, we'll be focusing on events that took place between 1990 and 1992. My name is Michelle Gibson. So far, patterns between 1945 and 1960 show events and people being manipulated for particular outcomes, deceiving us about what was really going on to gain our consent, like the examples of Korea and Vietnam, partitioning one country into two, setting up two different political systems, and then instigating them to fight each other. And in looking at what was happening in the years between 1961 and 1980, seeing things like the communists taking down hereditary rulers like Prince Norodom Sihanouk in Cambodia, and in Ethiopia with the overthrow of Haile Selassie, the last emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974. The full title traditionally of the emperors of Ethiopia was Elect of God, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, and King of Kings of Ethiopia, and were of the Solomonic dynasty, also known as the House of Solomon, was the former ruling dynasty of the Ethiopian Empire. Its members were lineal descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba through their son Menelik I, the first emperor of Ethiopia. The resulting new communist systems in both Cambodia and Ethiopia led to great suffering and death of the civilian population in both countries in no time, with the genocide of the Cambodian people in the killing fields of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge starting in 1975 and lasting until 1979, and the government of the Derg, another name for the Provisional Military Government of Socialist Ethiopia, taking over with the overthrow of Haile Selassie in September of 1974, resulting immediately in the Ethiopian Civil War, leading to famine and massive loss of life. Just a few years later, the Islamic Revolution took down the hereditary Shah of Iran as well, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in 1979, to replace the ruling imperial house of Pahlavi with the autocratic theocracy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, leading to the severe repression of the civilian population in all ways. Next, I have looked at what was happening between the years of 1981 to 1989. I graduated high school in 1981, and this was the decade that began my adulthood. What I found when I started doing the research in January of 1981 was that all hell broke loose all over the earth starting in 1981, with multiple assassination attempts and assassinations. AIDS came in, explosions in mines, frequent plane crashes and planes blown out of the sky by bombs, many massacres and atrocities against innocent civilian populations, regular people being blown up in discos and restaurants, and traumatically dying at theaters and sporting events, terrorist hijackings and suicide bombings, a multitude of sinking ships and train wrecks, single-shooter mass shooting events, and on and on and on through the decade, and that somehow all of this was normal. And that was just the 1980s. It is also interesting from the beginning of the 1980s forward was when the personal computer and internet came into being in our lives, ultimately allowing us to instantaneously connect with each other all over the world and bypass mainstream media for news and information. So what happened in our history starting in the decade of the 90s, beginning in 1990? On January 1st, two internet companies began selling internet service to commercial customers in the United States and the Netherlands. One was PSINet, which was founded on December 5th of 1989. PSINet was based in Ashburn in Northern Virginia. What else has its base in Northern Virginia? Well, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA, is based in Arlington. The roots of EUnet, the other internet company that was selling internet connectivity to commercial users going back to 1982, and the European Unix network. FNet was the French branch of EUnet. Starting in 1988, EUnet played a decisive role in Europe's adoption of the Internet Protocol Suite, known as Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP, and Internet Protocol, IP, of which versions of it were known as the Department of Defense model, because the development of its networking method was funded by the U.S. Department of Defense through DARPA. Once TCP/IP was in place, EUnet was able to connect with FNet and CERN's TCP/IP connections, and a connection to the U.S. was also established. On January 1st of 1990, EUnet started selling internet access to non-academic customers in the Netherlands. On January 3rd of 1990, General Manuel Noriega was deposed as leader of Panama and surrendered to U.S. forces, who had invaded Panama in mid-December of 1989, codenamed Operation Just Cause during the administration of President George H.W. Bush. The primary aim of Operation Just Cause was to depose Noriega as the de facto leader of Panama. He had long-standing ties with U.S. intelligence agencies dating back to the 1950s and was said to have been one of the CIA's most valued intelligence sources at one time. Interesting to note that George H.W. Bush was also CIA director from January 30th of 1976 to January 20th of 1977. Noriega was also said to have amassed a personal fortune through drug trafficking operations. The Sukkur rail disaster took place on January 4th, in which two trains collided in Sanghi, Pakistan, with the cause of the accident being listed as an improperly set railroad switch. Pakistan's worst rail disaster to date. It killed between 200 and 300 people and injured an estimated 700 more. 3 staff members on duty at the time were charged with manslaughter. Between January 12th and January 19th, an estimated 50,000 ethnic Armenians were driven out of Baku in Azerbaijan during what was called the Baku Pogrom in response to a formal effort to reunify the region of Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan with Armenia. During the 7-day period, Armenians were beaten, murdered, and/or expelled from the city of Baku, as well as raids on apartments, robberies, and arson conducted on Armenian citizens. The Armenian people have a history of being genocided in the region. Between 1915 and 1922, there are figures of at least 1.5 million Armenians having been killed. Then at the end of the Baku pogrom, on January 19th and 20th, also known as Black January or the January Massacre, Soviet troops occupied Baku as a result of a state of emergency declared by the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union and the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, and killed over 130 Azerbaijanis demonstrating for the independence of Azerbaijan from the Soviet Union. So at the tail end of the week, where Armenians were being targeted for different crimes by the Azerbaijanis for wanting to rejoin Armenia, the Supreme Soviet went after the Azerbaijanis for wanting their independence, not for them going after the Armenians. These events took place during the period of time between 1988 and 1991, which is when the dissolution of the Soviet Union unfolded. On January 22nd, almost immediately following the Baku pogrom and Black January in Azerbaijan, the League of Communists of Yugoslavia voted to dissolve itself, and in its place, the former republics of Yugoslavia formed their own local branches, the Socialist Party of Serbia, the Party of Democratic Changes of Croatia, which merged with the Social Democrats of Croatia to become the Social Democratic Party of Croatia, the Social Democratic Union of Macedonia, the Party of Democratic Reforms of Slovenia, which was renamed to Social Democrats in 2005, the Social Democratic Party of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Democratic Party of Socialists of Montenegro. We shall soon see what this led to with respect to the relationships between the former republics of Yugoslavia. On the same day the League of Communists of Yugoslavia voted to dissolve itself, January 22nd, Robert Tappan Morris was convicted of releasing the Morris worm, one of the first computer internet worms. I found some interesting things when looking up information on Mr. Morris. He developed his computer worm when he was a graduate student at Cornell University, though he released the worm from MIT. The Morris worm was designed to exploit existing vulnerabilities within target systems in order to gain entry, and was programmed to copy itself 14% of the time. He was the first person convicted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the United States versus Morris, and received a sentence of 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of $10,500, and additionally the cost of his supervision. After he completed the terms of his sentence, he completed his PhD at Harvard in 1999 and was appointed assistant professor at MIT. In 1995, he co-founded BioWeb with Paul Graham, a company that made software for building online stores, and which 3 years later sold for $49 million to Yahoo. He also co-founded Y Combinator with Paul Graham, Jessica Livingston, and Trevor Blackwell in 2005. Y Combinator is an American seed money startup accelerator that was used to launch such companies as Stripe, Airbnb, DoorDash, Coinbase, Dropbox, Twitch, and Reddit, to name a few. The Burns Day storm, also known as Cyclone Daria, took place between January 25th and January 26th in northwestern Europe. It was nicknamed after the Scottish poet Robert Burns, because it took place on his birthday. It was one of the strongest European windstorms on record, killing an estimated 100 people across Europe. Starting out as a cold front over the North Atlantic Ocean, it began to undergo what is called explosive cyclogenesis, the rapid deepening of an extratropical low-pressure area known as a weather bomb. It made landfall at Ireland on January 25th and then tracked over to Ayrshire in Scotland, where its lowest pressure was recorded around Edinburgh at 4 p.m. on the same day. From there, the storm headed across to Denmark, then caused major damage in the Netherlands and Belgium. In South Africa, on February 2nd, South African President F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the African National Congress and promised to release Nelson Mandela, which happened several days later on February 11th from prison near Cape Town. This is a great place to mention what is called the Mandela effect. The Mandela effect is typically defined as occurring when a large mass of people believe an event occurred when it did not, with most sources of information referring to it as a collective false memory. This effect gets its name from many people having memories that Nelson Mandela died when he was in prison in the 1980s. The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre took place in New Mexico on February 10th, where a total of 7 people were shot, and out of that number, 4 killed, by 2 unidentified gunmen who shot the victims in an office, set one of the desks in the office on fire, and left the scene. The case remains unsolved to this day. On March 1st, the fire at the Heliopolis Sheraton Hotel in Cairo, Egypt, killed 16 people and injured 70. The fire was said to have started in the luxury hotel's tent restaurant, literally a cotton canvas tent that was attached to one of 3 blocks of the T-shaped hotel. It was the only one of Cairo's 6 Sheraton hotels that did not have an alarm system or sprinklers, which were not required under Egyptian law. The fire, fueled by 25-mile-per-hour winds, destroyed most of the 630-room hotel and its restaurants and elaborate lobby, which featured tropical trees, plants, and live birds. Between March 11th and March 13th, there was a tornado outbreak in the central United States, which produced 64 tornadoes across 6 states. It was one of the most violent outbreaks ever documented in March. One of the thunderstorms on March 13th produced an F4 tornado in Nebraska that was on the ground for over 100 miles, or 160 kilometers. Another thunderstorm produced 2 F5 tornadoes. The first of these struck the town of Heston, Kansas, and was one of the most photographed and documented violent tornadoes in history. The largest art theft in U.S. history took place on March 18th, at which time 12 paintings and a Chinese Shang Dynasty vase, altogether worth $100 million to $300 million, were stolen from Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Art Museum. There is still a $10 million reward in place today for information leading to the recovery of the artwork. The museum was said to have been built between 1898 and 1901, with the design heavily influenced by art collector and philanthropist Isabella Stewart Gardner on the left, in the style of a 15th century Venetian palace, of which the 15th century Palazzo Santa Sofia in Venice on the right is an example of this type of architecture. It is important to note that when I first looked at the pictures of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston on the left, I was immediately reminded of the Royal Alcazar in Seville, Spain on the right, said to have been built over a period of 5 centuries, starting in the 1300s, which is located near the Back Bay Fence, said to have been designed by Frederick Law Olmsted as part of Boston's Emerald Necklace system of parks. This was the Stony Brook Bridge circa 1898 in Boston's Back Bay Fens. It and one other bridge crossing the Stony Brook Canal were demolished when the canal was filled in. On March 25th, an arson fire at an unlicensed Puerto Rican social club named Happy Land in New York City killed 87 and injured 28. It was said to have been caused by a Cuban refugee who had a fight with his ex-girlfriend and was kicked out of the club. Filling a container with $1 worth of gas, he returned to the club and set fire to the only known exit in the venue. I found a reference saying that the New York City Fire Department requested the assistance of the Center for Fire Research, who came and did a study using physical measurements on the site, floor plan drawings, and newspaper accounts, but did not take material samples or do testing. The Manchester prison riot, also known as Strangeways Prison in Manchester, England, started on April 1st and lasted for over 3 weeks, ending on April 25th. The riot started when prisoners took control of the prison chapel, and the riot spread quickly through the rest of the prison, including protesters on the rooftop. By the end of it, 1 prisoner was killed, 47 prisoners and 147 prison officers wounded, and much of the prison damaged or destroyed at a cost of £55 million to repair. Strangeways Prison in Manchester was said to have been designed by Alfred Waterhouse, an architect known primarily for work done in the Victorian Gothic architectural style, and said to have opened in 1868 with its slanted-looking features. Right next to the Manchester Assize Courts building, also attributed to Waterhouse and built between 1859 and 1864, and which was demolished completely in 1957 after having been severely damaged in the Manchester Blitz during World War II between 1940 and 1941. The City Bonds robbery occurred on May 2nd, one of the largest robberies in world history. A courier was robbed at knife point of 301 bearer bonds worth £292 million that were treasury notes from bank and building societies. The robbery took place on Nicholas Lane, an alleyway in the City of London. In a broad investigation, police found 299 of the original 301 certificates in places such as Glasgow, Miami, and Zurich. On May 13th, the Dinamo Zagreb-Red Star Belgrade riot took place at the Maksimir Stadium in Zagreb, Croatia. Both teams of the Croatian Dinamo team and the Red Star Belgrade of Communist Serbia consistently placed at the top of the Yugoslav First League. This football riot took place just a few weeks after Croatia's first multi-party elections in 50 years had taken place, with a majority favoring Croatian independence, with the communists being ousted in favor of more nationalist parties. The people wounded during the riot were stabbed, shot, or poisoned by tear gas. The Dinamo Red Star riot was believed by some to have sparked the Croatian War of Independence, which started at the end of March in 1991. More about this later. On March 22nd, leaders of the Yemen Arab Republic, North, and People's Democratic Republic, South, of Yemen announced unification as the Republic of Yemen. The history behind this, which is important to understanding what has taken place in Yemen since then, is that following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, at the end of World War I, when the former Ottoman Empire was divided between the countries on the winning side of the war, Northern Yemen became an independent state known as the Kingdom of Yemen. Then on September 27th of 1962, revolutionaries deposed the newly installed last king of Yemen, Muhammad al-Badr, and formed the Yemen Arab Republic, which was said to have been inspired by the Arab nationalist ideology of Nasser's Egyptian United Arab Republic. And this action started the North Yemen Civil War from 1962 to 1970 between supporters of the kingdom, which included Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and supporters of the Yemen Arab Republic, which included Egypt. By the end of the North Yemen Civil War, the supporters of the kingdom were defeated, and the Yemen Arab Republic was recognized by Saudi Arabia in 1970. The People's Democratic Republic of Yemen was known as the Aden Protectorate in 1918, which it had been known since 1874, with the creation of the British colony of Aden and the Aden Protectorate, which consisted of 2/3 of present-day Yemen. The Aden Protectorate existed until 1963, when it was merged with the new Federation of South Arabia. By 1967, the Federation of South Arabia had merged with the Protectorate of South Arabia and later changed its name to the People's Republic of Southern Yemen, becoming a Marxist-Leninist state in 1969, the only communist state to be established in the Arab world. With the 1990 reunification of Yemen into the Republic of Yemen, the new government was comprised of officials from both sides, with a de facto form of collaborative governance until the country went into civil war in 1994. So Yemen is yet another example of the practice of divide and conquer, with not only partitioning one country and people into North and South with different political ideologies and histories, as was the case with North Yemen, creating the civil war between the original monarchy and the new Arab nationalists after deposing the hereditary king, which reflects the pattern I mentioned at the beginning of this video regarding some of the other hereditary rulers taken down by communists in the 60s and 70s. Not only that, but what is the same emblem doing on the uniforms of hereditary rulers from diverse places, like Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the kings Lunalilo and Kalakaua of Hawaii? I looked around to find a match for the stars on the uniforms of these monarchs, and I found the chest star of the Order of Solomon's Seal, the oldest order of the Ethiopian Empire, said to have been given to the emperor and empress and the male members of the imperial family. The Ethiopian Order of Solomon's Seal was also said to have been given to Christian heads of state around the world, so that could explain, possibly, these other rulers having the chest star of the Order of Solomon's Seal. Or does it possibly mean something else altogether? Like perhaps all of these hereditary rulers were connected to King Solomon and the tribe of Judah, and not just in Ethiopia. Back to 1990. On the 2nd and 3rd of June, the lower Ohio Valley tornado outbreak spawned 66 confirmed tornadoes in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio, less than 3 months after the central United States tornado outbreak mentioned previously. Of the confirmed tornadoes, 7 were of F4 intensity in southern Illinois, central and southern Indiana, southwestern Ohio, and northern Kentucky. In Indiana, 37 tornadoes started forming on June 2nd, breaking the previous single-day record of 21 set previously on April 3rd of 1974. The Mega Borg oil tanker caught fire and exploded, causing an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico near Galveston, Texas on June 8th. The weather for the initial explosion was calm, and the tanker had passed Coast Guard safety inspections earlier that year. At that time, the oil tanker was transferring oil to a smaller tanker to transport to Houston because it was too big to dock. Then 2 days later, there were 5 more explosions in a 10-minute window, which increased the oil spill into the Gulf waters. It took the fire 8 days to burn out, and the incident was not without controversy for how it was all handled. On June 13th, the official start of the destruction of the Berlin Wall by the East German border troops began and ended in December. It had been opened for passage through 7 months before it was officially taken down. Nelson Mandela toured the United States and Canada between June 17th and June 30th, which was part of a bigger world tour that year in which he visited the United Kingdom, the Vatican, Cuba, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and Japan. The Manjul-Rudbar earthquake affected northern Iran on June 21st, killing between 35,000 and 50,000 and injuring between 60,000 and 105,000. In addition to the cities of Manjul and Rudbar, widespread damage occurred in Tehran as well. Things that the region of Manjul and Rudbar is known for today are as follows. It is the location of Iran's largest wind farm, and I suspect the world's wind turbines and farms to be harvesting an unknown energy technology and not wind. Of the Manjul Dam, construction of which was said to have started in 1956 and that it opened in 1962. And the ruins of the legendary Alamut Castle high in the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, said to have been the home base of the legendary hashish eaters known as Hashashin, the origin of the word assassin. And I have to wonder if the Alamut Castle was actually a star fort, because I have found the words castle, citadel, and fortress being used as names for what were actually star forts. And yes, high on rocky promontories like this one. On July 3rd, the Mecca Tunnel tragedy occurred during the Hajj, a pilgrimage to Mecca that takes place every year. The disaster was said to have started when a pedestrian bridge railing bent, causing 7 people to fall onto people exiting the tunnel, which soon filled with 5,000 people in a space with a capacity for 1,000 people. It was surmised that the cause of the tragedy, which resulted in the suffocation and trampling deaths of over 1,400 people, was caused by crowd hysteria from the people falling and the failure of the tunnel's ventilation system. Saudi Arabia's king at the time, King Fahd, declared that the tragedy was God's will, and even though other countries complained, calls for an international investigation were rejected by the Saudis. The Luzon earthquake killed more than 1,600 people in the Philippines on July 16th, less than a month after the Manjul-Rudbar earthquake in Iran, with a 7.7 magnitude on the Richter scale. It produced a 78-mile or 125-kilometer-long rupture on the island of Luzon. RELCOM was launched on August 1st in the Soviet Union by combining several computer networks in the Kurchatov Institute, Russia's leading research and development institution in the field of nuclear energy, in collaboration with Demos, a Unix-like operating system developed in the Soviet Union, leading to its first connection to the Internet. Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, and within 2 days, most of the Kuwaiti military was either overrun by the Iraqi Republican Guard or retreated to the neighboring countries of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Then the Iraqi government set up a puppet government known as the Republic of Kuwait, annexing the country as the 19th province of Kuwait and saying that it had always been an integral part of Iraq and only became an independent nation due to the interference of the British government as a result of the Anglo-Ottoman Convention of 1913. The Plainfield tornado struck Plainfield, Crest Hill, and Joliet in Illinois on August 28th, killing 29 people and injuring 353, with $165 million in damages. It was the only F5/EF5 tornado ever recorded in the United States, in which the enhanced Fujita scale puts no wind speeds for EF5, the highest level. Tim Berners-Lee began his work on the World Wide Web while working at CERN on August 1st, 19 months after his beginning outline of it in 1989, and by November 12th, he and Belgian computer scientist Robert Cayau had submitted the first formal proposal to build the first project called the World Wide Web. By December of 1990, Berners-Lee had built all the tools necessary for a working web and the first website. The World Wide Web was invented by someone working at CERN. The Rwandan Patriotic Front invaded Rwanda from Uganda on October 1st, marking the start of the Rwandan Civil War. This took place less than a month after Pope John Paul II visited Rwanda on September 7th. The Pope spoke to the Rwandans about his sorrow at the famine which was devastating Rwanda at the time. Then the onset of the Rwandan Civil War pitted the Rwandan armed forces against the Rwandan Patriotic Front in a guerrilla war, and which was said to have arisen from a long-running dispute between the Hutu and Tutsi tribes within the Rwandan population. Rwanda had existed as a kingdom ruled by the Tutsis until 1962, though it was considered a colony of German East Africa from 1885 to 1916, and Belgium from 1916 to 1962, with both European nations ruling through the kings and perpetuating a pro-Tutsi policy. After 1945, a Hutu counter-elite formed, and this led to a deterioration in the relations between Tutsis and Hutus, with the Hutus calling for a transfer of power to them, which was also supported by the Catholic Church and the Belgian colonial government. This is a photo of King Mwami Mutara III Rudahigwa of Rwanda. His rule started in 1931, and he died unexpectedly in 1959 after visiting a Belgian doctor in Burundi, where he had gone for a meeting with Catholic missionaries. On October 2nd, there was a collision between a hijacked airplane that was attempting to land and two other airplanes on runways of Guangzhou's Baiyun Airport in China, resulting in 128 deaths and 53 injuries. The official day of the reunification of West and East Germany was October 3rd and is celebrated as such as a national holiday every year. South Africa ended segregation of libraries, trains, buses, toilets, swimming pools, and other public facilities on October 15th as part of the ongoing negotiation process between the government of South Africa and the African National Congress that started in 1990 to end apartheid. On November 13th, the Aramona massacre in New Zealand took place, in which 13 people were killed by mass shooter David Gray after a verbal dispute between him and a neighbor. Gray was shot after a manhunt and died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. It was the deadliest mass shooting in New Zealand's history at the time, and led to major changes in New Zealand's firearms legislation in 1992, which included 10-year photographic licenses and a restriction on military-style semi-automatic firearms. And this is the interesting-looking Aramona Massacre Memorial, which sits in a small hollow near the town, and consists of a granite column sitting on a granite base in the middle of a squared circle formed by low stone walls and surmounted by a pyramid made by galvanized steel poles. On November 21st, two things happened with regards to Europe and the end of the Cold War. The newly formed Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe signed a Conventional Forces Treaty in Europe, reducing the conventional forces of NATO and Warsaw Pact countries. And the Charter of Paris for a New Europe was signed on the same day at the end of a summit meeting with most European nations and the United States, Canada, and the Soviet Union. The Paris Charter was one way of bringing in the former Eastern Bloc countries into the ideological framework of the West, and among other things, established an office for free elections in Warsaw and a conflict prevention center in Vienna. On November 29th, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678 authorizing military intervention against Iraq if it did not withdraw its forces from Kuwait and free foreign hostages by January 15th of 1991. The first German federal election held since reunification was won by Helmut Kohl on December 2nd, who became the first chancellor of the newly reunified Germany. During his 16 years as the German chancellor, he participated in the ending of the Cold War, the process of German reunification, and the creation of the European Union. On December 3rd, there was a plane collision on the runway at Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport. involving one plane taxiing onto an active runway in a dense fog and being hit by a departing plane and resulting in 8 deaths and 10 serious injuries and 23 minor injuries. Slobodan Milosevic won the general election as a socialist on December 9th to become president of Serbia. And on December 16th, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a former Catholic priest, was elected president of Haiti, ending 3 decades of military rule. I have to ask before I go on to 1991 is whether or not there is a connection between CERN, the Internet, and the Mandela effect. I'm curious because EUnet showed up on January 1st of 1990, selling Internet access to commercial interests after having been instrumental in connecting with FNet and CERN's TCP/IP connections, as well as to the United States once TCP/IP was in place around the time. On February 2nd, Nelson Mandela was freed from prison in South Africa, and by the end of the year, Tim Berners-Lee had built all the tools necessary for a working World Wide Web and the first website. Were all of these occurrences in the same year just coincidental? Or was there either a planned aspect or residual time-altering effect resulting from this? I don't know the answer to this. This is a very interesting finding for me. I have heard in the past, and I do not remember when or where, that CERN had something to do with the Mandela effect. Also, 1990 in many ways seems to have been a year on one level that would herald real peace, freedom, and reconciliation with what was going on in South Africa, the reunification of Germany, and the steps taken to end the Cold War, and the beginning of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But is that what was really happening? Or was it all part of a scripted plan for how to subjugate and control humanity all along? I will also be tracking weather, earthquakes, airplane, and other disasters, as they have been occurring quite frequently from what I have been finding in the historical record in both the 1990s so far and also in the decade of the 1980s. And even these 2 plane crashes in the fall and winter of 1990 in different places were attributed to different causes, and yet the effect looked very much the same. Now let's take a closer look at what happened in 1991. The capital of South Ossetia, Tiskenvali, was attacked by military forces of Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains region of Europe and Asia on January 5th, which started the 1991-1992 South Ossetian War. South Ossetians wanted to secede from Georgia and become an independent state. By the end of this war, the South Ossetians became a de facto independent republic in the middle of Georgia, but for the most part internationally recognized as part of Georgia and remains so to this day. On January 7th, there was an initial coup attempt to oust the newly democratically elected president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, by Roger Lafontaine, a leader of the Tonton Macoute, a paramilitary force under former dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier, but he was thwarted and failed. Tonton Macoute was also the name given to what is called a Haitian mythological boogeyman, meaning Uncle Gunny Sack, who kidnapped and punished children by snaring them in a gunny sack and carrying them off to be consumed at breakfast. The second coup attempt on September 29th of this same year was successful, and Aristide was deposed by the armed forces of Haiti and exiled to France. The U.S. Congress passed a resolution on January 12th authorizing the use of military force to expel Iraqi military forces from Kuwait after President George H.W. Bush requested it on January 8th, 1 week before the January 15th UN deadline for withdrawal of Iraqi forces. Operation Desert Storm began on the following day, January 16th, with airstrikes against Iraq, as the first fighter aircraft were launched from Saudi Arabia and U.S. and British naval carriers in the Persian Gulf. The first major ground engagement of the Gulf War, the Battle of Khafji in Saudi Arabia, took place between Iraqi and coalition forces on January 29th and lasted until February 1st with a coalition victory. Other events on February 1st included U.S. Air Flight 1493 colliding with a SkyWest Airlines Metroliner on the runway at Los Angeles International Airport, killing 34 people. The accident was attributed to the control tower for the given reasons of a series of distractions, a misplaced flight progress strip, and an aircraft that had inadvertently switched off the tower frequency, and the SkyWest flight was told to taxi onto the runway that the U.S. Air Flight was landing on. For what it is worth, David Koch was one of the survivors of the crash, who, along with his brother Charles, was one of the billionaire Koch brothers worth more than $100 billion combined at the time of David's death from cancer in 2019. And also on February 1st, a Hindu Kush 6.6 magnitude earthquake caused severe damage in northeastern Afghanistan in its border area with Pakistan, causing landslides and destroying power and transmission lines. On February 7th, ground troops entered Kuwait through Saudi Arabia, which was the beginning of the ground phase of the war. On the same day of February 7th, the Provisional Irish Republican Army launched a mortar attack on 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence and headquarters of the British government, during a cabinet meeting discussing the Gulf War. Then on February 18th, the Provisional Irish Republican Army struck again, exploding bombs at the mainline London stations of Paddington and Victoria in the wee hours of the morning, with 1 death and around 40 injuries occurring at the Victoria station. Interesting that I can find very few images relating to it. I found this New York Times article regarding the incident, and several pictures of basically the same scene as this one. Iraq accepted a Soviet-backed ceasefire on February 22nd, which the U.S. rejected, however instead said retreating Iraqi forces would not be attacked if they left in 24 hours. Saddam Hussein announced the withdrawal of Iraqi troops on February 26th, at which time, along with other subversive activity against the Kuwaitis as they were leaving, they set fire to Kuwaiti oil fields as they left, and the fires lasted until November of 1991. And Kuwait City was devastated by the end of Operation Desert Storm. On February 27th, President Bush declared victory over Iraq and ordered a ceasefire, with U.S. troops starting to leave on March 10th. And on the same day, in the Bangladeshi general election, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party won 140 of 300 seats in the supreme legislative body of Bangladesh, known as the Jatiyo Sangshad, and made Khaleda Zia as Prime Minister, the first woman Prime Minister of Bangladesh. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party was founded on September 1st of 1978 with a view of uniting the people with a nationalist ideology for the country. United Airlines Flight 585 from Denver crashed in Colorado Springs on March 3rd, killing all 25 on board. The crash was attributed to a rudder hardover, causing the plane to roll over and go into an uncontrolled dive, and ultimately to a defect in the design in the Boeing 737's rudder power control unit, after similar accidents and incidents involving Boeing 737 aircraft. On March 9th, 2 people were killed and tanks deployed in the streets when massive demonstrations took place in opposition to the newly elected president of the Socialist Republic of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, and his Socialist Party. The Sierra Leone Civil War began on March 23rd. It started when the Revolutionary United Front attempted to overthrow the government of Joseph Momo. It is important to note that the southern and eastern part of Sierra Leone are rich in easily accessible alluvial diamonds, which was considered to be a factor in the Civil War. The Civil War in Sierra Leone lasted 11 years and left an estimated 50,000 dead. The term blood diamond is typically used to refer to diamonds that are mined in a war zone and sold at the same time to fund aspects of the war, and has been used to label the war in Sierra Leone, as well as other 20th and 21st century African civil wars that took place in Angola, the Ivory Coast, Liberia, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. On March 31st, the ruling Socialist Party of Labour of Albania won by a landslide in parliament in the first multi-party election since 1923, though it had advantages while campaigning, including influence over the news and access to more resources than its opponents, and it was widely believed that the Albanian election was neither free nor fair. While the Socialist Party of Labour lost seats, it won more than the number of seats needed to maintain the majority quite handily. On April 5th, former U.S. Republican Senator John Tower and 22 others were killed in an airplane crash in Brunswick, Georgia. The reason given for the crash was a propeller malfunction due to a design flaw with the Embraer EMB 120 Brasilia twin turboprop airplane. The aircraft did not have a flight data recorder or cockpit voice recorder because they were not required at the time. Senator Tower had led the Tower Commission, which investigated the Iran-Contra affair from December 1st of 1986 to February 27th of 1987, when a report was published with the conclusion that the CIA director at the time, William Casey, should have taken over the Iran-Contra operation and made the president aware of the risks and notified Congress legally as required. Also in the report, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, National Security Advisor John Poindexter, and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger were implicated in the operation. Lieutenant General Oliver North was initially convicted on 3 felony charges. But the charges against him were vacated and reversed, and all charges against him were dropped by a judge on September 16th of 1991, and he later became a television host, political commentator, and NRA president. National Security Advisor John Poindexter was convicted on April 7th of 1990 of lying to Congress and obstructing the congressional committees investigating the Iran-Contra affair. But these convictions were reversed on November 16th of 1991 on appeal. Former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was indicted on felony charges. He received a pardon on December 24th of 1992 from President George H.W. Bush before he left office, before Weinberger could be tried on these charges. On April 10th of 1991, the Italian ferry Moby Prince collided with an oil tanker off the coast of Livorno, Italy, resulting in 140 deaths and only 1 survivor, and is considered one of the 2 worst environmental disasters in Italian history. Along with the explosion and loss of the oil tanker Amico Milford Haven the very next day near Genoa. The Amico Milford Haven was loaded with 144,000 tons of crude oil, equivalent to 1 million barrels, when it exploded on April 11th and caught fire, flooding the Mediterranean Sea with 50,000 tons of crude oil. After burning for 3 days, the vessel broke into and sank. On April 22nd, the 7.7 magnitude Limon earthquake struck Costa Rica and Panama, causing an estimated 47 to 87 deaths and over 700 injuries, and displacing between 7,500 to 11,000 people. It was the strongest recorded earthquake in Costa Rica's history. A series of 55 tornadoes broke out in the central United States on April 26, killing 21 people, named the Andover tornado outbreak after an F5 tornado that hit the town of Andover, Kansas. But it also spawned a severe tornadic outbreak in addition to Kansas in the states of Oklahoma, Nebraska, Texas, Iowa, and Missouri. On April 29th, around 2 months to the day after the general election in Bangladesh, where the Bangladesh Nationalist Party won the majority of seats in parliament, a tropical cyclone hit Bangladesh, killing 138,000 people and causing an estimated $1.5 billion in damage. The storm hit at high tide, and the 20-foot or 6.1 meter storm surge wiped away whole villages. There were 13.4 million people affected by the storm, with 1 million homes destroyed, leaving 10 million people homeless. It was one of the deadliest cyclones on record. Also on April 29th, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake hit Racha, Georgia, killing 270 and leaving 100,000 homeless. The earthquake struck almost 5 months after the onset of the South Ossetian War in the same region. The Racha region and the districts of Oni and Ambrolori that the earthquake was centered on in the southern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains are right next to the borders of South Ossetia, outlined in red in this Google Earth screenshot. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in the Caucasus Mountains. Landslides caused a lot of damage from the earthquake and caused at least 1 chasm in the landscape of the region, with the Bangladeshi cyclone and the Georgian earthquake hitting in different parts of the world with nationalist aspirations on the very same day makes me wonder, what are the odds of these events happening randomly, all in the same year, and even on the same day? On May 21st, Mengistu Haile Mariam, president of the Communist State of the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, fled Ethiopia to Zimbabwe after the Soviet Union had pretty much ended its support for his regime, marking the official end of the Ethiopian Civil War. Mengistu had been highly involved in the Derg, the provisional military government of socialist Ethiopia that had overthrown the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie in September of 1974, and he was the General Secretary of the Communist Workers' Party of Ethiopia from 1984 to 1991, concurrently with being president between 1987 and 1991. It is also important to note that I found this article saying that Haile Selassie was strangled to death in 1975 after his overthrow in 1974, and that Mengistu's government was responsible for it. On May 28th, the forces of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, said to be a coalition of ethnic federalist political groups in Ethiopia, seized the country's capital, Addis Ababa. On June 17th, the body of former U.S. President Zachary Taylor was exhumed to determine if arsenic poisoning instead of acute gastrointestinal illness had caused his death, but no trace of arsenic was found in his remains. General Zachary Taylor, a hero of the Mexican-American War, was elected president in 1848. After only 16 months of serving his presidential term, he died in July of 1850, allegedly after consuming copious amounts of raw fruit and iced milk at a July 4th fundraising event at the Washington Monument, becoming severely ill with a digestive ailment and dying several days later, on July 9th, with Millard Fillmore becoming president upon Taylor's death. The Warsaw Pact was officially dissolved in Prague, Czechoslovakia on July 1st. Nigerian Flight 2120 caught fire after takeoff in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia on July 11th and crashed while attempting an emergency landing there, killing all 261 people on board. It was a Nationair Canada DC-8 airplane that was subleased by Nigerian Airways to transport pilgrims to and from Mecca, and it remains the deadliest airplane accident involving both the DC-8 and a Canadian airline. The cause for the fire was attributed to the overheating of an underinflated tire, leading to an in-flight fire. On August 6, Tim Berners-Lee announced the World Wide Web project and software on the alt.hypertext newsgroup, and the first website, info.cern.ch, was created. The former Iranian Prime Minister under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shapur Bakhtiar, was murdered in Paris by agents of the Islamic Republic on August 7th, along with his secretary. Hurricane Bob brushed the Outer Banks of North Carolina on August 18th and 19th, and then approached the coast of New England on the 19th, hitting the coast of Rhode Island twice as a Category 2 hurricane. Then it went into Maine and New Brunswick and Newfoundland in Atlantic Canada, leaving extensive damage in the Northeast, killing 18 people and causing at least $1.5 billion in damages. On August 25th, Serbia attacked Vukovar in Croatia, launching the Battle of Vukovar and 87-day siege of Vukovar in eastern Croatia. It pitted under 2,000 Croatian National Guard soldiers and civilian volunteers against the 36,000 soldiers of the Yugoslav National Army and Serbian paramilitaries equipped with heavy armor and artillery. During this time, it was the first European town to be entirely destroyed since the end of World War II, and the fiercest battle in Europe since then as well. When it ended in November of 1991, over 20,000 of its inhabitants were forced to leave, and hundreds of soldiers and civilians were killed, with most of its population being ethnically cleansed of its non-Serb population. The term ethnic cleansing came into use in the 20th century to mean the systematic forced removal or extermination of ethnic, racial, and/or religious groups from a given area, frequently with the intent of making the area ethnically homogeneous. The then newly elected socialist president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, and other Serb military and political officers were later indicted and in some cases jailed for war crimes. And he was found dead in his cell in March of 2006 in the UN War Crimes Tribunal's detention center. The beginning of the siege of Dubrovnik was on October 1st, which was a military engagement between the Yugoslav People's Army, the military of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and Croatian forces defending the city of Dubrovnik when the Croatian government had declared independence from the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. While it ended at the end of May in 1992 with a Croatian victory, during the course of the siege of Dubrovnik, the Yugoslav People's Army had bombarded the city, including the Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Over the weekend of October 19th and 20th, a large suburban firestorm occurred on the hillsides of northern Oakland and southeastern Berkeley in California. By the time it was brought completely under control on October 23rd, the fire had killed 25 people, injured 150, and caused $1.5 billion in damages, destroying almost 3,000 single-family dwellings and 437 apartment and condo units. It was the third most deadly wildfire in California history. Between October 28th and November 3rd, what became known as the perfect storm, or the Halloween storm, struck the northeastern U.S. coast and Atlantic Canada, causing over $200 million in damages and 12 deaths. Interesting how the path of the storm, as it was building up before it made landfall, looked like an almost perfect figure 8. During almost the same dates as the Halloween storm, the Halloween blizzard hit the U.S. upper Midwest, killing 22 people and causing $100 million in damages between October 31st and November 3rd. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine signed the Belovza Accords in Belarus, officially ending the Soviet Union and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. And on December 26th, the Supreme Soviet met for the last time, formally dissolving the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War. All remaining Soviet institutions ended on December 31st. Now let's take a peek at what happened in 1992. On January 6, shortly after the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of December, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, known as Artsakh, was proclaimed by the Armenians within Azerbaijan. The Republic of Artsakh exists to this day and is closely reliant on Armenia, to which it is connected by one overland road known as the Lakin Corridor. On February 1st, President George H.W. Bush of the United States and President Yeltsin of Russia met at Camp David and formally declared the Cold War over, after both leaders had issued statements on January 26, announcing that neither side would target each other and their allies with nuclear weapons anymore. The Maastricht Treaty was signed between the 12 member states of the European Communities on February 7th, which was the foundation treaty of the European Union. Announcing a new stage of European integration, it had provisions for a shared European citizenship, the eventual introduction of a single currency, and for common foreign and security policies. The United Nations Resolution 743 was passed on February 21st to send a UN peacekeeping force to Yugoslavia. The Khojaly massacre took place on February 25th and 26th in Nagorno-Karabakh, involving the massacre of around 200 Azerbaijani citizens by the local Armenian forces. On March 13th, the 6.7 magnitude Erzincan earthquake in eastern Turkey left between 500 and 652 dead and injured 2,000, with total financial losses amounting in US dollars to $13.5 million. There were over 3,000 aftershocks after the initial earthquake. The Erzincan Basin is on the northern side of the North Anatolian Fault. The Assembly of Bosnia and Herzegovina, without the presence of the Serb political delegates, proclaimed independence from the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia on April 5th. On the same day, 13,000 Serb troops besieged the city of Sarajevo following a mass rebellion of Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina against the Bosnian Declaration of Independence from Yugoslavia. The stated goal of the Bosnian Serbs was the creation of a new Bosnian Serb state called the Republic of Srpska. It was the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare, lasting 3 years, 10 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. It was besieged by the Bosnian Serb army from April 5th of 1992 to February 29th of 1996, which took place after the official end of the Bosnian War with the signing of the Dayton Agreement on December 14th of 1995. Of the almost 14,000 people killed during the siege, approximately 5,500 were civilians. An international tribunal at The Hague in the Netherlands after the Bosnian War convicted 4 Bosnian Serb officials of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Also on April 5th, Alberto Fujimori, the president of Peru, issued a decree that dissolved the Congress and judiciary of the Republic of Peru and had opposition politicians arrested and imposed censorship, which set off the 1992 Peruvian constitutional crisis as he assumed full legislative and judicial powers. Fujimori was later convicted of human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and embezzlement, for which he is still serving time in prison after a presidential pardon for him in 2017 was annulled in 2019. On April 10th, 43 Armenian civilians were killed in the Moraga massacre when their village was captured by the Azerbaijani armed forces during the Nagorno-Karabakh War. On the same day as the Moraga massacre, on April 10th, a provisional Irish Republican Army bomb exploded in the Baltic Exchange in the city of London the day after the general election, which re-elected John Major as Prime Minister, killing 3 and injuring 91. The 1-ton bomb was concealed in a large white truck consisting of a fertilizer device wrapped with a detonation cord made from 100 pounds of Semtex, a general-purpose plastic explosive, and was the biggest bomb detonated on mainland Britain since World War II. It severely damaged the Baltic Exchange and its surroundings. The Roermond earthquake took place on April 13th with a 5.3 magnitude and affected the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. Striking on the Peel boundary fault near Roermond, it was the strongest earthquake to hit the Netherlands and northwestern Europe on record. It caused substantial damage to older buildings in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. On April 22nd, there was a series of 10 explosions caused from gasoline leaking into the sewer system in the district of Analco Colonial Atlas in Guadalajara, Mexico, and exploded, with an official death toll of around 250 people. But it is estimated that the death toll alone was 1,000, with around 500 people missing, 500 injuries, and 15,000 people made homeless, with damage estimates ranging between $300 million and $3 billion. The last two republics of the former socialist Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro, formed a new state called the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia on April 28th. This brought to an end the official states' union of the former countries of Yugoslavia that had existed pretty much since 1918 until 2003. On May 5th, one of the terraces of the Armand Cesari Stadium collapsed in Bastia, Corsica, during a big football match, resulting in the deaths of 18 people and injuring 2,300. The terrace had been added without restrictions to increase the seating capacity by 50%, specifically for the game between the Sporting Club Bastia and the Olympique du Marseille, which was the best team in France at the time. The structure collapsed before the start of the match, and the game was never played. The West Ray mine disaster occurred on May 9th in Nova Scotia, when an explosion caused by a methane leak killed all 26 workers on the night shift. It had only been open for 8 months before the disaster took place and was closed afterwards, and was permanently sealed in 1998. The Treaty of the Commonwealth of Independent States Collective Security Treaty, or CST, was signed on May 15th. On June 23rd, the Israeli Labor Party won the Israeli legislative election under the leadership of Yitzhak Rabin, and he became prime minister for the second time on July 13th. Rabin was the prime minister during the Oslo peace process, during which time the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, recognized the State of Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, accepting each other as negotiation partners. He was assassinated on November 4th of 1995, we are told by an extremist gunman, and was the only Israeli prime minister to have been assassinated. The 7.3 magnitude Landers earthquake took place on June 28th near Landers in California's San Bernardino County. There was especially severe damage to the area around the epicenter, including buckled roads and collapsed buildings and chimneys. The earthquake caused a 43-mile or 70-kilometer-long surface rupture. Loss of life was minimal, as it struck in a relatively unpopulated part of the state, but the earthquake caused $92 million in damages. On July 16th, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, who, along with his running mate Al Gore, accepted the Democratic nomination for president and vice president on behalf of the forgotten middle class. The Slovak National Council declared Slovakia an independent country on July 17th, which was the beginning of the end of the country of Czechoslovakia, which had existed since 1918, with the breakup of Austria-Hungary. On July 23rd, Abkhazia declared independence from Georgia. War started between Abkhazia and Georgia in August of 1992. During the war, the Abkhaz separatist side carried out ethnic cleansing of expelling up to 250,000 Georgians and killing more than 5,000 ethnic Georgians. War between the two sides has flared intermittently since then. While Georgia doesn't have control of Abkhazia, the Georgian government and most UN member states consider Abkhazia legally part of Georgia. There were 2 plane crashes on July 31st. Thai Airways International Flight 311 crashed onto a mountain north of Kathmandu in Nepal, killing all 113 people on board. And China General Aviation Flight 7552 crashed during takeoff from Nanjing Airport, never leaving the ground, killing all but 19 of the 126 on board. Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida on August 24th. It was the most destructive hurricane to ever hit Florida for structures damaged or destroyed, and was only one of 4 hurricanes to make landfall, which it did in South Florida as a Category 5 hurricane, along with the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, the 1969 Hurricane Camille, and the 2018 Hurricane Michael. Andrew also caused extensive damage in the Bahamas before reaching South Florida, and had Louisiana in its destructive sights as well. By the time Hurricane Andrew had dissipated over the Tennessee Valley, it had destroyed more than 63,500 homes and caused $27.3 billion in damages, and was the costliest hurricane financially in U.S. history until Hurricane Irma in 2017. Also on August 24th, the Concordia University massacre took place in Montreal, Quebec. The perpetrator of the violent weapons assault on campus, resulting in the murders of 4 of his colleagues, was Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering Valerie I. Fabricant, who for some reason had been allowed to work at the university for 13 years, with a history of disruptive behavior described as undesirable to intolerable during that whole time to students, staff members, and other academics. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. On September 11th, Hurricane Iniki hit the Hawaiian Islands. It was the costliest hurricane to strike Hawaii, resulting in $3.1 billion in damages, and the third costliest in United States history at the time, taking place less than a month after Hurricane Andrew, the costliest hurricane at the time. The 16-year-old Mozambican Civil War came to an end on October 4th with the signing of the Rome General Peace Accords. The Mozambican Civil War was exacerbated by polarizing Cold War politics and was fought primarily between the ruling Marxist Front for the Liberation of Mozambique and the anti-communist Mozambican National Resistance. There was a 5.8 magnitude earthquake in Cairo, Egypt on October 12th, injuring over 6,500 and making 65,000 homeless. The number of buildings completely destroyed in the Cairo area was 350, and another 9,000 were severely damaged. There was a 7.7 magnitude earthquake in Nicaragua on November 2nd. It triggered a tsunami, which does most of the damage and casualties, and killed at least 116 people, with 68 people missing and over 13,500 left homeless. Damage in Nicaragua was estimated at between 20 and 30 million US dollars. In the U.S. general election, Bill Clinton was elected president on November 3rd. On November 24th, China Southern Airlines domestic flight 3943 crashed on descent to Julin Airport and killed all 141 on board. The cause of the crash was attributed to the pilot losing control of the aircraft. The test engineer for the SEMA group used a PC to send the world's first text message via the Vodafone network on December 3rd to the phone of a colleague. On the very next day, December 4th, the U.S. military landed in Somalia after the still President George H.W. Bush ordered 28,000 troops to Somalia in what was described as an effort to restore order to a conflict-ridden country and a humanitarian mission to distribute food to the Somali people that was being prevented by Somalia's warring factions. On December 12th, there was another major earthquake, this time the Flores earthquake in Indonesia, with a 7.8 magnitude, which also caused a tsunami, which reached the shore in 5 minutes. It ended up being the largest and deadliest earthquake of 1992, that year of earthquakes. At least 2,500 were killed or missing near Flores, more than 500 injured, and 90,000 left homeless. So, among many other things in 1992, after the celebrated end of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, we already see civil wars, genocide, and ethnic cleansing occurring within former republics of the Soviet Union, as well as civil wars, ethnic cleansing, and genocide in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. This is not the progress that one would expect from our historical narrative, and is instead the reverse of it. It would appear to be the immediate descent into chaos and violence from the departure of a centralized system of government, as well as chaos from communal violence in other parts of the world as well. There was not only the prevalence of civil wars in 1992, but also numerous earthquakes and hurricanes of major intensity around the world. It seems like we have been living in real-life simulations and applications of things like the Hegelian dialectic of problem-reaction-solution and Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. The controllers create the problem, get the reaction they desire, and then they provide the solution, which frequently involves taking away freedoms for our own protection. Then they lie to us and gaslight us about what was really taking place, deflecting blame from themselves and projecting it on others. The DHR factor listed in the methods of manipulation is undetectable mind control. I didn't know what that was, so I looked it up. It is interesting what comes up to the surface when digging back through our relatively recent history and looking at it with new eyes. It's not hidden. They tell us without telling us that they are telling us, and have been continuing on with the planning and implementation of their dark plans for all humanity right in front of our eyes.